this session is really about tooting your own horn to book the gig. And just so that you know a little bit about why I chose that language, I worked as a professional entertainer and dancer before I moved into academia. So I spent a considerable amount of time in what you would call interview situations, where, for example, I would be asked to speak off the top of my head on a topic for the camera, just so that they could capture me in motion, what I look like when I move, when I communicate. Other times when I was singing, they would ask to do a mic check. So I would have to speak into the microphone. And sometimes you're talking about a mic check for a very small room. And other times you're in a stadium where your voice is carrying quite a bit. And feeling comfortable in those situations can be very difficult. So when I moved into interview situations in sort of the like more professional situations for business, I was really prepared to step into those situations with confidence because I'd been exposed to these other opportunities. So I really enjoy the opportunity to speak with young people about taking up space and about how to operate in these situations so you can book the gig. And of course, in the entertainment industry, when we get a job, we often call it booking the gig. So today, we're going to start just by introducing ourselves, but we're also going to look at how we prepare for these situations, how we listen using your voice, gestures, how to answer questions successfully and speak to your strengths. And then we'll have a little question and answer period at the end if there's anything that you'd like to ask me that's specific. But I do invite you to participate because a lot of these things are it's not just about seeing what needs to be done. It's about walking through. And when we're here together today, this is a safe environment where you can try these things. Now, it's easy for me to say it's a safe environment, but I'm hoping you will feel it's a safe environment where you can try these things for yourself and kind of get a chance to walk through them. As I said, my experience in the entertainment industry allowed me to practice a lot of these things in advance of it becoming part of the hiring process. So for starters, something really, really easy to do. We're just going to tell our name and our favorite food because that is something that's quite accessible. And I know for myself, when I talk about my favorite food, I get pretty excited. So I'm Hannah Solinsky, and my favorite food would have to be right now, it's vegetable navratam korma. And it's my favorite because it's a very warm dish that is quite flavorful, but it also has tofu in it. So I know when I'm eating it that I'm contributing to some sustainable practices by avoiding meat. And that's really important to me in the grand scheme of things. So that's my favorite. My favorite food is vegetable navratam korma. That's my pick. That's okay, Lauren. You do not have to talk, but would you like to maybe put in the chat what your favorite food is? You're more than welcome to just type it in. And Alicia, you can either say or you're welcome to also chat too. I don't mind if you'd like to, if you'd prefer both of you to operate through the chat, that's totally fine by me. And then you'll have notes to take with you to practice later. I'm very, very relaxed, so whatever works best. So just go ahead and type. Ah, yes. Now, Alicia, why is your favorite food sushi? What is it that you like about it? And Lauren, if you're able to, you can go ahead and type your favorite food as well. Oh, you also like sushi because there's so much variety and you love seafood. Excellent. Okay. And Alicia's also saying the variety of options and having a little bit of everything. Okay, so what often happens in an interview situation is we're asked a question. Oh, thank you. Thank you. My favorite food is Vietnamese vermicelli. The flavor and how fresh it is. Your aunt's Vietnamese. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, C. Now, these are great examples because what often happens when we're in an interview is they say, well, oh, thanks for coming, and did you find everything okay? And we say, oh yes. And but if they ask us a question, for example, what's your favorite food? And I know this may not necessarily come up in an interview, but it's a good example. We'll say, oh, my favorite food is sushi, and then we just leave it at that. When you're in an interview, There are two great things to think of when you're answering a question. One is the because. Because tell them a little bit about why it is that you're answering the way that you're answering and the why. What's the big why that's connected to it? Now, in some cases, your big why will have to do with you as a person. It may center into some things that are important to you, your values. It may center around something that you've identified as important for the position. It depends. But this is one of the reasons it's really good to read through the profile or the posting carefully, because there are very subtle opportunities to connect back to some of the bigger picture pieces about either the company that you're interviewing for or the position that you're interviewing for. So, for example, with Alicia saying her favorite food is sushi and she likes the variety of options, and the same with Lauren, that variety, that tells me that your minds are open to opportunities. You're not saying like, I like sushi, but I only really like this exact piece and I'm not that interested in anything else. It's showing that you have an eye for being open to a variety of options. And that piece around you love seafood, that also includes a whole bunch of information in my mind that I know about seafood, and it allows me to get to know you a little better. The other piece here is what Elise put in about how she likes the vermicelli, the flavor, and how fresh it is. That speaks to her palate and her interest. If something is fresh, it's very crispy and brings it forward. That leaves almost a taste in my mouth as the interviewer, as a fresh, sort of bright feeling in my mind and in my mouth, just based on the answer that was given. So, those because pieces and the why pieces, they not only offer information about the person, but they also allow you to speak to yourself a little more fully. So, for example, if I'm asked about my food, I answered with my the vegetable navratam korma, and I was able to speak to the flavor of the piece and describe it a little bit, how it makes me feel, but also how it relates to some of my values around, being wary of sustainable practices and that kind of thing. Those opportunities are there for you if you are able to recognize them and sort of take advantage of them. And it just gives a little bit of an indication of you as a person. So the next thing that we're going to do is a couple of breathing exercises, because this is how you prepare. Now, as bizarre as this is, you may think, well, but it's just an interview. I don't really need to breathe. Except, how many of you have ever been to an interview and you are in the office, you're waiting, you're sitting outside, and you're a little nervous, so your mouth is a little bit dry and your tongue starts to get a little thick, and you're sort of swallowing, and then the breathing goes a little, and you find that when you're answering questions, you're kind of drinking in air. These are things that happen to people regularly. And if you have the opportunity to take Communications 235, which is a public speaking course, we look at this quite closely about preparing your breath and your voice to be heard. And in an interview situation, or in a situation where you are answering questions either in a private interview, or even more importantly, sometimes you're interviewed, say, for the news or on a talk show, those kinds of opportunities are presented to you. It's really important to prepare your voice for those, because we often get out of breath. And I'll tell you, you have a reserve of air in your lungs, but our lungs are about this big and we're usually only taking up about this much of it. And then the reserve is just about that much. What you want to do is do these exercises to create a full breath reserve so that you have lots of air to use, but also so that your jaw is settled and ready to speak slowly, clearly, and concisely. So right now, what I'd like you to do is just put your feet flat on the floor. You are going to put your hands on your legs just to settle yourself. And you can close your eyes if you're comfortable, or keep them open and just sort of soften your gaze and breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, or in through your nose, out through your nose, in through your mouth, out through your mouth, however is most comfortable. I like in through my nose and out through my mouth. So breathe in and breathe out. Good. Now think about the air going into your neck. Breathe in and breathe out. Good. Think about the air going into the top of your tummy. Breathe in and breathe out. Now think about it going all the way down to your toes. Breathe in and breathe out. So what that does is that begins to increase that reserve of air. So you have more air to draw from when you're speaking. That means that if you have a longer sentence or a longer response, you don't run out of air and start. It's the things we do when we're stressed. You sort of try to fit in something at the end of a sentence. You want to avoid doing that. So that helps you with that aspect of speaking. Then exercise 2 is a little bit, you may want to run into the loo when you do this one so you have a little privacy, because if people can hear you, it can be a little embarrassing unless you're like me and you've done it so many times you just don't care. So take a fist and just gently drum on your chest and then say, and make circles with your hand. Good. It doesn't take very long. And your voice, you can hear it even in my voice already. It just drops. Other fist and circular motion. One, the air reserve is fully opened up. And two, it accesses a resonance in your tone that deepens your tone. It allows you to sound confident and full-bodied in your voice. So this is one more piece to the puzzle. And then our last exercise, this is the most ridiculous, but at the same time, it really is good for you, in particular when it comes to enunciation and to speaking slowly. Because as we know, the night before an interview, we can really clench our jaw. That can make you talk with using your face in unusual ways, but it can also make you speak very, very quickly because you are having so much tension in your jaw that you just kind of, everything just kind of tumbles out one at a time. And instead of being able to understand you, you just sound like a googly mess. So relax your jaw, just run your hands down your jaw, clasp your hands in front of you, and shake your hands forward and back. Now, here's the hard part. You relax your jaw, say, with your hands, and then shake and let your jaw just rotate a bit. That relaxing of your jaw gives you space. It's space in your mouth and space in your throat and a relaxation in your body that allows you to appear very calm, very controlled, and it allows you to speak slowly and to complete your sentences fully on a full tank of air. So these are just some quick exercises that you can do, and I will release this PowerPoint so that you'll be able to access it and go through the exercises for yourself. But these are the preparatory exercises. The next piece that we'll look at is listening. And listening is an incredibly important piece, but also when we say, are you listening? We sort of think like, yeah, of course I'm listening. The problem is oftentimes in an interview, one of two things is happening when we're listening. Either we're going back to what just happened. So let's say, for instance, when you came in, you kind of caught your toe on the edge of the chair. You sit down, and as you're being introduced to everyone, you're thinking in your head, oh, I can't believe I just fell over with a chair. Like, how did that happen? Instead of focusing on the names that are being given to you of the panel. And the names of the panel are going to prove to be important as you go through. So as people are introduced to you, one thing that I do is I repeat their name back to you, back to them. There's two pieces of that. One is for pronunciation to ensure that I'm pronouncing their name properly, but also to remember. So this is Julie. Hi, Julie. Nice to meet you. This is Prabpreet. Hi, Prabpreet. It's a pleasure to meet you. And this is Huang. Hi, Huang. It's a real pleasure to meet you. That allows you to have their names come out of your mouth. And then if you have the opportunity, reinforce it, because threes are really important. Hearing, saying, and then repeating. Julie, Prabpreet, Huang, it's thank you all for having me today. And then there's a very good chance that you will remember these names easily during the interview. So once you've heard names, then it's time to listen to the questions. Listen. There are particular words that are important. So for example, if they ask you to list your strengths, and you say, well, one of my strengths is organization. I take organization very seriously, and I blah, 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 blah. And you haven't given them a list of things to choose from, to go from. You've instead already focused on one piece, and perhaps you think that's your only strength. What do they interpret from that answer? So, for example, list your strengths. You're going to want to speak to the strengths, and we'll talk a little more about this that you've earlier identified for yourself and sort of reviewed in the waiting area before you go in. So you'll think about, for example, things that are important. If you were to hire someone, think on their side. For the position that you're interviewing for, what would be important? Obviously, communication in most in most positions is important. Honesty, reliability, being a team player, and identifying what a team is and how they function best. These are some examples of pieces that are important. But if you just say, I'm a strong communicator, I am responsible, I'm honest, and I really enjoy teamwork and a team environment. And they say, okay, tell us about a time you were organized. And you've already, like, they may have a list of questions that they have to ask. If they've said, list your strengths, and you've told them about a time that you were organized, then they'll jump to the third question. And you may have skipped over an opportunity to speak to other strengths that you have, but because you missed the word list, the interview moves in a completely different direction. So really be attentive to the language so that you're answering the question that's been asked of you. And we're going to talk about answering questions and how to keep the right question in your mind and in your mouth a little later. But the first piece of that, the most important piece of that, is listening and taking in what is being said to you. Just a reminder too that one thing you can do if you're listening and you miss something is say, I'm sorry, could you just repeat that? Because I really caught the first part, but I'd like to revisit the second part of that. There's so much information that's being given to you. Don't ever be shy about asking to repeat or clarify something that you're unsure about. That shows that you're listening, and good listening skills are incredibly important. Then using your voice. Now we've done our exercises, we've done our breathing, we've done our drumming. Now it's time to make use of that incredible voice that you have awoken through your warm up. When you come into the room, and this is a trick that I find is incredibly useful. I'm going to turn my camera on so I can make sure that you can actually see me. When you come into the room, if you walk in and the chair is here, and you walk in and you say, hi, I'm Hannah Selinsky. It's really nice to meet you. Thank you for having me. You're moving and speaking at the same time. So they're taking in a lot. If you walk into the room and you stop and you say, hi, everyone, I'm Hannah Selinsky. It's very nice to meet you. That gives them an opportunity to introduce the people that are there, to stand up and shake your hand if they want to, or bump elbows, depending on how they feel. But it also gives them a chance to see you. And they will take in more of you if you stop and speak than if you're moving and talking. So walk in, stop, say who you are, and then they'll invite you to take a seat. Thank you so much. It allows them to see confidence and to hear you for the first time. That first impression is one of confidence and self familiarity and a presence in the room, as opposed to sort of a rushed, harried kind of entrance and sitting down. Take the space. And oftentimes, I do end up saying this to a lot of my students: take up space. Don't come into the room like you're apologizing. You've been invited there. Walk in with an open mind and open shoulders. Say who you are and have a seat, and then invite them into your space. And that is one way of setting up to use your voice efficiently and effectively. And then when you do speak, be sure to speak slowly, to enunciate, um, and take your time with your answers. There's no need to rush. Oftentimes, people think that if they answer quickly, um, one of two things: either they're nervous, so they answer quickly out of nervousness. But when you slow down a little bit and you take the time to consider your answers, it allows you to insert extra information as you go along and answer fully instead of rushing. It also avoids what we talked about earlier. It allows you to find the because and the why if it's appropriate for that particular question. Sometimes you're bringing that in as you're talking. And if you speak slowly and clearly, they'll understand you. They have time to come along with the sentences mentally, and it allows you to answer fully. So be very careful and wary of your voice, and be sure to use your voice effectively. Okay. Our next piece is gestures, and gestures are they can be a lot of fun, but they can also be a little bit problematic. And the two examples that you see there are the robotic gestures, where it's clear that I am using my gestures. And then the speedy gestures, where it just kind of looks like your hands are kind of popping around all over the place. And you'd be amazed the things that people do with their bodies when they're nervous. Like, they just have these strange things that happen. If you've ever watched bad acting, you'll know what I'm talking about. Where it's like there's this one hand that is just constantly emphasizing everything that is said, or it strangely comes up and you make a statement and the hand comes up, and they ask a question and then the hand comes up. These odd gestures. So it's important to practice interview situations and encounters that you will have. For example, if you're asking for a raise, practice asking for a raise with your partner, with your friends, with your parents, your siblings, and somebody on the bus who's willing to participate. Practice these situations with other people in advance, because it will allow you to feel embodied in the experience when you get there. So part of my PhD research is around embodiment and feeling at home in a situation. And if you've already done the situation a few times and you've emulated the situation you'll be in, when you actually get into the situation itself, your body responds and says, okay, I know this situation, as opposed to going into a new situation. That's why sometimes your body reacts strangely, because it's not at home in this sort of unexpected environment. So out of the fight or flight response triggers your adrenaline, which makes you sometimes speak very quickly, but also move very quickly. And those movements can be distracting. They can take away from your answers, but they can also be a little overwhelming for trying to extract what it is that you mean out of the situation, because you're moving around so much. So very excellent gestures that are helpful are when you're making a list with your hand. The second thing, the third thing, that helps you stay on track and it helps you remember what you were talking about, but it also signals to the panel where you're at in either in the story or in the answer. If you are comparing, I mean, I know these sound obvious, but it's incredible how often our gestures don't match what we're saying. So we'll be saying no and we're nodding, or we say yes and we're shaking our heads. Those small pieces send confusing signals. So be aware of what you're doing and use open gestures that invite the panel into what you're saying. Don't be afraid to nod when they're talking, or hold still if you're unsure, because it signals that you're unsure without making this face, which can uh, seem negative. If you hold still and you look as though you're pensive, it can prompt them to say, do you understand? Or you can say, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? And if you offer your hand out when you say, could you repeat that? That is a way of inviting them to come forward again to repeat what they've said. So that can be incredibly helpful. The other thing with gestures is try not to point. Um, it can be seen as, first of all, if you're straight on, you disappear. My finger disappears into what I'm saying. If it's on an angle, you can see, but it's a bit aggressive, as opposed to using the politician point, which is a little more gentle. Yeah, so these slight gestures that are kind. Now, here's the other thing. If you get a little bit nervous when you're talking, don't be afraid to hold your hands in your lap. Just be careful of gripping them, because it's a signal of stress. You may need to remind yourself to relax. Something else that you can use is, I sometimes use a pen when I'm speaking in front of people. So this would be for presentations. In an interview, it'll be a little, little strange if you've got a little conductor pen. But when I'm presenting at the front of a room, I often use a pen either to gesture or just to have in my hand to hold, because it's something that you can do with your hands so they're not wandering around looking for something to do. That can be incredibly helpful. Okay, so that kind of covers our gestures. And then this is the really big one, when you're answering questions. And answering questions is, I coach some people who are they're either working professionally and going into interview situations, or situations where they're being interviewed by the press. Um, Other clients are either in the music industry or film and television, and they are going into interviews with the press. Some, I'm trying to think. I haven't worked with anybody in politics for a very, very long time, and it was very low end politics, even the people that I did work with. But then there are people who are in pageants or contests that involve an interview process. Okay. The Generally, the interview questions that come towards the end are the ones where you really need to craft your answer and stay on track. And this is the most important part of answering a question, is answering the question that's asked of you, instead of sliding off track a little bit. So if you get a question that comes across as something like, describe a time you worked in a team. What worked, what didn't, and how did you address dissent? Okay, there's a few things happening here. Describe, so that's not, tell us about is a little less descriptive than describe. That means they want you to go into sort of specific detail. What worked, what didn't, and how did you address dissent? So if you are not familiar with the word dissent, you should ask. When you say dissent, exactly where are you headed with that? Or what do you mean by that? I want to be sure that I'm My understanding of dissent is the same as yours, because dissent is almost like an academic term for disagreement, and it has implications that they may wish you to address specifically, or they may just be using the word that they feel is most appropriate to mean disagreement. You want to be sure. So take the time to ask questions about any words that you're not familiar with. Then you want to start the response with the focus of the question. So for this question, I would say, I'm going to break this into a few sections. First, I'm going to describe a time that I worked in a team. I can remember at HMV, I worked there at this time. This was my position, because it's not just sort of telling them about the team. They've asked you to describe it, so to bring it into detail, the people that were involved, how they worked together, what that team meant to you. And then you say, okay, what was the second part of that question? What worked and what didn't? And how did you address dissent? So you start with the focus of the answer. Let me tell you about what worked. These are the things that we did, and that was what worked. Now, what didn't work was, you go through that piece and then say, and that's what didn't work. So you bookend the question, the answer with the point of the question. This is how I address dissent, or I address dissent by, you go through, and in the back of your mind, you know that what you're talking about is dissent. If you start just wandering off into the answer, oftentimes what happens is you forget what the question was in the first place and you get lost in the question. But if you start your response with the focus of the question, it allows you to loop back and say, and that was, so you arrive where you started. It's got a full feel to it. There are two things that are a strength in that. The first one is that the panel feels that you have answered the question fully. They appreciate that you've gone full circle and come around. Now, this is where the work that I did with people who are public facing, where this is important. So if you are in a situation where you're being asked by the press or asked by someone publicly to comment on or to address something, and there are pieces that you really are not necessarily comfortable or are unable to discuss, it allows you to circumvent those pieces and come back to the point of the question without going into too much detail on those fronts. And that can be very important when you're protecting privacy or when you're protecting pieces of information that are confidential, so that you don't wander into the answer unprepared and you accidentally offer information that is not yours to offer. Okay, that can be a really important piece of answering questions. So that's why it's so important to listen to the question, to go into the focus of the question, to answer as much as you can, and then bring it back around to finish with the focus of the question. So list your strengths. When I list my strengths, I think of this, and I'd say that those are my real strengths. Focus, information, back to the focus. Describe your strengths. My strengths can be described as varied. They can be described as, you can go into all the pieces of how your strengths fill you out. And that's how I would describe my strengths. Why do you want to work here? I would love to work here because I identified these pieces of your structure, these pieces of your human resources. These are the opportunities that I will have, and that is why I would like to work here. Keeps you focused on your response by starting with the focus and then looping back to the focus. Yeah, so this is the big trick to answering questions. Here are the specifics of the question. If you have to ask for them to reinforce something or just describe a piece to you, by all means do that. Then start the response with the focus, answer the question, and loop back around to the focus of the question. Okay, so this is the last piece that I'm going to talk about today before we go into questions from you, and that is speaking to your strengths. So know yourself. And one of the ways that I go through strengths with my students is I start by um, list skills or strengths that you have learned at school. So, what have you learned at school? And think about that. You know, you probably have citation skills and reading skills. Maybe you're a speed reader. Maybe you write quickly. What are the skills and strengths that you personally have picked up through your education? And when you make this list, don't leave anything out. Don't think, well, everybody can do that. Never do that, because not everybody can do the things that come naturally to you. And you may not be aware of that until you, like, for example, in my mind, I sometimes talk to myself and I describe things that I'm seeing with words. I didn't know that not everybody thinks that way until I started to talk to my friends about how their internal voice, some of them, it's just sort of a feeling that they get about something. Some of them see sort of pictures. All of our minds work in quite unique ways, and we don't really know that not everybody thinks that way. Chance to talk to other people about it. Okay. It's the same with our skill sets. Our skills come, some things come very naturally to us, some things we've had to learn over time, but we're not aware that we carry these skills and how these skills can be put together to be very unique skill sets until we take the time to identify them. So write down everything from your education. What have you learned from work opportunities that you have had? And that may be things like ordering, inputting, scheduling. It could be hiring, having difficult conversations with people who are not necessarily fulfilling their obligations to the job, having celebrating successes. What are your strengths? Then think about what you've learned from your friends, from your family, and from your passions. What is it that you like to do? And this could be soccer, it could be dance, it could be knitting, it could be bird watching, it could be anything. But if you're a bird watcher, you have specific observation skills and identification skills. If you're a dancer, you have certain skills that come from understanding music and time and the work ethic that goes into practice. These are all pieces that can be applied other places, but until you identify them, it's very difficult to identify opportunities to highlight them outside of the original parameters. When you go into an interview, they may ask you, and you may say, yes, I actually, scheduling is something that I'm very familiar with. You may not have identified that for yourself in the job description, but it may be there, but just worded a little differently. And then you have the opportunity, you've already thought about it, thought about when it was and how it was that you came to adopt that skill, and you're able to speak to it quite freely. Make that list, make it deep, and carry it with you. And before you go in, just review it and remind yourself of all of the things that you are capable of, so that you have a vast inventory to draw from when they give you the opportunity to speak about yourself and speak to your strengths. Also, remember that each and every one of you carries very specific and special skill sets that are unto you alone. This is the power of being a human being. We all have similar things that happen. We all enjoy certain things and have things that we prefer. But within these experiences are subtle nuances that are singular to each person. And that allows us to approach ideas, to approach situations from a unique perspective that is ours and ours alone. So when you go into an interview situation, it's your opportunity to really enjoy that information and that strength that you bring to the table. Whatever it is that has brought you to that moment is your experience and yours alone. And that's what makes you unique. So allow them to see those pieces of yourself and celebrate that. The last thing that I'll say about an interview process is something that I learned. I'm going to loop back around to my performance experience. When I auditioned for, say, for commercials, I would audition for probably 100 commercials and hear next 100 times before I heard, can you come back on Tuesday and do this again? And then For every time that I got to come back on Tuesday and do it again, there would be 1 or 2 times where my agent would get the call and I would book the gig. All of those no's did not deter me. All of those maybes that became no's did not deter me because I knew that if I kept going for all the no's and the maybes, there would be a yes. And when it was yes because I was the particular person that was appropriate for that particular gig. There was no one else who was able to fill it. I was the one. And when you go to interviews, when you hear no, just remember this is something that I learned through those experiences auditioning. It didn't mean that I wasn't the most talented person in the room. It didn't mean that I was the person who had the lousy audition. I might have been the person who had the best audition and was the most talented, but I wasn't exactly right for that particular part. When you go into interviews, they're looking for someone who's not just the strongest on paper with the strongest resume, with the strongest interview. They're looking for the person who's the right fit. And that may be somebody who needs to grow in certain areas, somebody who needs to be experienced in certain areas, or someone who just fits with the group of people that they've already hired. When you don't get the gig, it doesn't mean that you won't get the next gig. Just keep going back, keep at it. Because what makes you unique when you hear that yes, you will know that you are the right person for that particular gig. And you'll enjoy it all the more because you'll know that it's a good fit all around. So these are all of the big pieces that I've brought to the table just to remind you to breathe before you go in. All the breathing, drumming, listen to the questions that are asked you. And then when you answer, you'll have that because and why to fill out your answer so you can tell them more about yourself. Speak slowly and clearly so that they can take in all of the information. Use your gestures, but try not to go too quickly. And answer questions by framing your response. Start with the focus of the question, answer all the way around, and come back to the point. List your strengths ahead of time so that when you go in there, you can show them why you're singular and special. And this is truly the point of today and all the information. And I just want you to know that you've got this. I said so. So go out there and go get those gigs. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you today. And now I'd like to open things up for you to, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to make, I'd love to hear from you. And please feel free to just put those in the chat. You can take a second to come up with those pieces. I won't rush you. I know it takes a second sometimes to type out, especially questions. So go on ahead and ask any questions that you've got. And while we're waiting, if you don't necessarily have a question, perhaps you could pop into the chat one thing that you're going to take away from today's session that will stay with you that you'll be able to apply right away. And I hope that there's at least a couple of things, but maybe you can just grab one for me so I know how you did. Ooh, okay. Elise, that's a great question. This is the answer, believe it or not. Always have water with you. Think about any time you've ever seen a person speaking, particularly at a podium in front of a large group of people. They always have water and they're talking and they're talking and they're talking. Sometimes you forget where you are in your speech. Sometimes you just get the shaky legs all of a sudden. I have a lip that goes like this when I'm really nervous and I can't even control it. It just goes, right? You stop for a minute. You say, just a moment, please. You take a sip, put your glass back down, look to your speech, identify where you are, take a breath for a moment, and come back into it. It seems like forever to you, but it is such a short period of time. And audiences wait happily. They've seen people do it a million times. It's not a big deal. Take a drink and just take a second to bring yourself back in. I also find that those breathing exercises that I did at the beginning limit that because the nerves come from that shallow breathing. And then you start, when you're swallowing air because you're nervous, it can come on suddenly. Or if you lose air and you start swallowing air to try to get air, your body says, uh-oh, there's trouble. And it releases that fight or flight, that adrenaline. And you get nervous because you feel the adrenaline come into your system. So those are two things. Make sure to do your breathing and have a glass of water there for you to take that second. Lauren, when giving a presentation, what is the best way to stand and appear confident? Is it okay to move around? Okay, Lauren, this is a great question. I practice first, like I teach that public speaking course 235. And for the first speech, I make everybody stand still, and they hate it because they want to move around. But the problem is, until you've stood still, when you move around, you're sort of dark. It's not, there's no rhyme or reason. It can be nervous pacing. What you want to do is practice standing still first, and then you'll feel moments where it seems like the right idea to either go to one side or go to the other. When you are sort of compelled to move standing still, you'll think, okay, that I may need to move there. But until you've done it standing still, you'll just pace back and forth. But there's nothing wrong with moving. Absolutely. I actually prefer it. I don't like a podium because it's like a it's a barrier between myself and the audience, and I want to feel them close to me. So I would much rather stand in the middle of the stage and talk. Find a point where it's appropriate to walk to one side or the other, talk to those people in the audience, walk all the way across the front, slowly talking to the people in the middle. And you can turn your back, especially if you're mic'd, just to move back to the center and then come down the middle to the front to finish. Just remember that that's the most powerful movement you can make, is starting from the middle of the back of the space and moving to the front. So if you start back here and you go over here, you come around, come back, and then move down to the end, it puts a real like punch on the finish. But if you start at the back, you go around, move to the front, you come back to the middle, and then say there's a really sad ending to the speech, or you want to leave the people feeling a little bit of an ethereal feel. If you slowly walk backwards at the very end of the talk, the further away you are from the audience, the more mystical and sort of removed you are from them. That's why in classical ballets, all of the little willies, the fairies, they all enter from the back, because that is the more removed, sort of ethereal part of the stage. The further you are forward, the more real and tangible you are. So use those pieces to your advantage. When you're way at the back, you're ethereal and removed. When you're right up at the front, you are right with them and tangible. And moving from that ethereal into the sort of real is the strongest way you can approach an audience. So feel free to move around, but practice standing still first so you know when it's really, truly important for you to move. And for standing, as I said, if you stand and you hold your hands like this, it's very natural, but it also avoids feeling like you don't know what to do with your hands. And holding a pen can be a great way to use your hands to make you feel comfortable without feeling like you've got sort of something formal up at the front, like a clipboard or something. And when you speak at a podium, it's very important to remember that that piece is there. So it's doubly important to invite the audience to you. The other thing I'll say about standing is try not to lock your knees. If you bend your knees just a little bit, it makes you appear, it allows you to breathe better, and it allows you to be more present in your body. And then Alicia's asking, what's the best way to respond to an interview question where they ask you to list or describe your biggest weakness? Okay. This is an important thing to know about yourself. I don't know if either of you have ever seen that episode of The Office where they say, describe your strengths, and he's like, well, I care too much, I love too much, and then they're like, well, describe your weakness, and he's like, well, my weaknesses are my strengths. Know your weakness. And the best part is being able to say, I've really struggled with, and maybe it's something to do with technology, maybe it's something to do with interfacing with people, perhaps it's something to do with organization. And you say, I'm really looking to work on that. That's something that is a focus for me to get better at. And I'm hoping that there are, if there are structures that are in place for me to take advantage of, I absolutely would. It lets them know that you're aware of where you need work. It's not, they're not going to say, oh, well, they'll have to do a course on computers. And that's sort of like, whew. There are so many resources that are available to people who are in jobs right now that for me anyway, in my opinion, knowing your weaknesses are just as important as knowing your strengths and being able to speak to them. And how, if you show that you've given them thought and you have a plan of action or action steps that you know you can take, that's showing that you are self-aware, but you're also self reliant and resilient. You know what you need to do to address that, and you're willing to take those steps. But don't be afraid to be honest about what you feel your weaknesses are at this point. For me, it's easy for me to identify my weaknesses. Oftentimes, it's things like I'll say yes to too many projects, and then I really have to stretch myself thin in order to complete everything. I have to learn to say no. Or if it's something to do with technology, I get frustrated quickly. So knowing where to go, like I need to know, for example, for Blackboard, I needed to know where the help section was for Blackboard so that I could solve my own frustrations quickly. It's okay to have a weakness. You just need to have sort of a plan for how you would address it. Then I know I missed some of the meeting, but what are the best questions to ask an interviewer? This is hugely important, Brielle. Great point. In some of my past interviews, they've asked me if I have any questions, and I'm often not sure what to ask. Okay, so perhaps it's pieces around benefits that they offer. Perhaps it's pieces around expectations for, particularly now, what are the expectations for or opportunities for working remotely? Is this something that you feel that you're planning to incorporate, or what are your thoughts on it? Does this position provide any support for technology? Will I be given any computers, any, these are the kinds of questions that you can ask, and ask freely. If there's any questions you have around the umbrella that this company operates, or the ways that the interactions are conducted. For example, perhaps you have questions about how you receive feedback. What are when you go in for a review, what are the procedures for review? Think in advance about the positions that you've had in the past and the pieces that have been difficult or uncomfortable for you, and ask about those pieces. There's no need to say, in past job, this kind of sucked, but you can ask, how do you address these situations or these kinds of issues? What's provided to me by way of supports? And if I were to sign on, when would you need me to start? And what if I wasn't able to do that? Is there any room to move that around? Those are the kinds of pieces that show that you've given thought to the position. The other thing is, if there's anything in the job description that you read that you thought, oh, that's interesting, and they didn't ask about it in the interview, that's the point to say, I noticed in the job description that you asked for this and you didn't ask me about that. I'm just wondering how important that is within the context of this role. It shows that you're really familiar with the job description and you've kind of prepared in your mind to address questions that are related. And it shows that you've been giving some thought to that in advance. And that's a really good way to interact with the job description in the interview. If they don't ask you about pieces of it, you can point that out at that time. Does that help, or have I missed any pieces of that, or do you feel that sort of gives you a bit of an angle on that section of the interview, Brielle?
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we just have 2 more minutes, and I just want to thank the 3 of you. Brielle, welcome. I know you weren't here at the beginning, but that's totally okay. I was delighted to have you. Alicia, I appreciated you coming in early. I was glad to see your name come up. And Lauren, I also appreciate you being here right from the beginning. Thank you all for coming today, and I hope that this has given you some ideas and some skills and some tools that you can take forward to your interviews. And have a wonderful day and good luck. And let me know. I'll put my email in the chat. And if you ever need anything or you have any questions later, please feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to chat with you. This is right. Okay. Yeah, Elise, thank you so much for having me and giving me this opportunity. This was a real pleasure. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day and we'll see you soon.